I told him he'd never belong here. I said it plain, no hedging, right across a conference table with his resume sitting between us like it was already trash. 14 years running fabrication lines, an associate's degree he'd paid for himself, one-night class at a time, while working a full shift. None of it mattered to me in that room. I looked at him, in that suit that fit him better than it had any right to on what I figured he made, and I told him this wasn't a place for a man like him. I used the word belong. I meant it the way it sounds. He didn't argue with me. He picked up his own folder, squared the corners of it against the table like he was closing out a shift report, and thanked me for my time. I was wrong. I didn't know it yet, but I was wrong the second the words left my mouth, and nothing that happened after changed that, though it took me the better part of 8 years to understand it had nothing to do with what came after at all. My name is Deborah Kessler. Everybody who's worked for me longer than a week calls me Dee. I'm 64 years old. I've lived in Youngstown, Ohio my whole life, except for 4 years at Kent State I don't talk about much. And I run Kessler Machine and Fastener Company, which my grandfather started as a 6-man tool and die shop in 1951, and which now machines precision components for the automotive and heavy equipment trade out of 110,000 square feet on the east side of town. I've got a husband, a son, 380 employees on the payroll as of this telling, and a story I've never said out loud in full before. I'm going to tell it to you in the order it happened, because that's the only way I trust myself to tell anything. If I try to tell it any other way, I'll start making myself sound better than I was, and I won't do that. My grandfather, Stanislaw Kessler, came off the boat from Poland in 1949 with a trade and nothing else. He shortened his name to Stan because it was easier for foremen to yell across a floor. He rented space above a garage on Wilson Avenue, bought 2 used lathes on credit, and by the time he died in 1979, he had 40 men working for him and a reputation for holding tolerances nobody else in the valley would touch. My father, Walter, took it from 40 men to 200 and moved us into fasteners and axle components right as the mills started closing down around us, which is a whole other story about timing and luck I won't get into here. What matters is this: I grew up inside that building. My father's rule, and it was a rule, not a suggestion, was that anybody who wanted to run something for him had to start on the floor first. No exceptions, including his own daughter. I was doing invoices and running a deburring wheel by the time I was 19. I know what a Bridgeport mill sounds like when the bearings are going. I know how to read a micrometer to a 10,000th. I earned every bit of standing I ever had in that building with my hands, and I was proud of that. And I still am. But here's the part I have to say plain, because the whole rest of this doesn't mean anything if I don't. Somewhere along the way, the pride I took in clawing my way from the floor to the boardroom curdled into something else. I started believing that the climb itself was the test, and that some people, no matter how far they climbed, just weren't built for the top of it. I want to be exact about what I mean, because I spent a long time being vague with myself about it, and I'm done with that now. I looked at a man who'd come up exactly the way I had, off a factory floor, self-taught, and I decided he couldn't sit across a table from a customer and be taken seriously, because he didn't sound like the customers did, because he didn't have the right degree behind his name, and because he was black, and in my head, without ever once saying that last part to myself in so many words. That got folded into all of it. I told myself it was about polish. It was never only about polish. I can tell you where some of that came from, though I'm not telling you this to be let off the hook for it, because knowing where a thing comes from doesn't make it less yours. In 1983, my father took me to a supplier conference in Detroit, my first one, and I sat at a lunch table across from 2 men from a German transmission company in suits that cost more than my car, and one of them asked my father, right in front of me, whether his girl did the typing for him. I was 21 years old, and I wanted to put my fork through his hand. I spent the next 30 years making sure nobody ever looked at me and thought, "Girl, who does the typing again?" I dressed a certain way. I learned to talk a certain way in a room like that, flattened my valley vowels down when I needed to. And somewhere in there, instead of deciding that judging people by their surface was garbage, full stop, I decided the smarter move was to get good at the game everybody else was playing, and then to keep score by those same rules once I was the one holding the cards. I turned into somebody who could size up a stranger in 4 seconds and tell you whether the customers would take him seriously, and I trusted that instinct like it was a caliper reading. It wasn't a caliper reading, it was just prejudice with better posture. My husband, Frank Doyle, came from the sales side, not the shop, which used to be a joke between us, him being the one who'd never turned a wrench in his life. We married in 1986. He ran the company as president for the better part of 20 years, while I sat as chairwoman and handled the money and the board, which suited us both fine, because Frank could charm a bank examiner and I could not. Our son Danny goes by Kessler in the business, not Doyle, which was my idea and probably says more about me than I'd like. He was groomed for this from the time he could walk the floor without an escort. I'll get to Danny. He matters to this story more than I wish he did. The first time I ever laid eyes on Marcus Webb, it wasn't in that boardroom. It was 2 years before, at a regional manufacturing quality conference at the Mahoning Country Club, of all places, where he gave a 20-minute talk on how he'd cut scrap rate at a competitor's stamping plant in Warren from 11% down to under 2% in 14 months. I remember thinking it was a decent presentation. I remember thinking decent like that was the ceiling on him. Plant floor guy. Knows his numbers, fine for what it is. I didn't ask him a single question afterward. I went and talked to the German transmission rep instead, the son of the man who'd once asked about my typing, because that felt like the room I needed to be in. I didn't think about Marcus Webb again until his resume landed on my desk 18 months later, and even then, I'd already half decided what I thought of him before I read past the first line. By the time Marcus Webb walked into that conference room in the spring of 2018, our plant manager position had been open 4 months, and I was tired of interviewing men in blazers who could talk about synergy but couldn't tell you the difference between a jig and a fixture. My operations director, a man named Ray Petrosky, who'd been with us 11 years, had pushed hard to get Marcus on the shortlist. Ray kept saying the same thing over and over, like he knew I wasn't hearing him the first 4 times. This guy turned around the worst performing line at Ohio Stamping Group in under 2 years, cut downtime 30%, and every single person who'd ever worked under him would follow him into a fire. I heard all of it. I nodded at all of it. And I still walked into that room having already decided plant manager wasn't a floor job. Not really. Not the way we ran it. Plant manager sat in on customer visits. Plant manager stood next to me when a man from Ford or from Cummins walked our line and wanted numbers explained to him in a way that made the customer feel like their business was safe with us. I had convinced myself, without ever once saying it in those words, that a man like Marcus Webb could run the floor beautifully and still lose us the account the moment he opened his mouth in front of the wrong client. Marcus was 41 years old that spring. He'd grown up in Youngstown, same as half my workforce, the South Side, raised by his grandmother after his mother died young. And he'd gone straight into the trades out of high school, because college wasn't a road anybody in his house knew how to point him down. He got his associates in industrial technology from Youngstown State 14 years in, 1 class a semester, on top of working full shifts, because he'd made a promise to his daughter that she'd never hear him say a degree wasn't worth the trouble. He had a wife, Renata, who taught 4th grade at a school on the east side, and 2 kids, a daughter named Simone, who was 17 that year and already talking about nursing school, and a younger boy, Elijah, who was 10. None of that was in my head when he sat down across from me. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't even bother learning who he was before I decided who he was. He wore a gray suit, tailored, no flash to it, a plain silver watch, and he set his folder down square in front of him the way a man does who respects a table. His resume was clean. 14 years at 3 different plants, each one a step up. Each one with hard numbers attached to what he'd done there. Ray had told me, before Marcus even walked in, that Marcus had turned down 2 prior job offers from bigger operations in Cleveland because he didn't want to uproot his kids mid-school year, which should have told me something about the kind of man he was, and it did tell me something. I just filed it under the wrong heading. I filed it under not ambitious enough for us, instead of under a father who keeps his word. The interview itself went 35 minutes. I'll give you the shape of it plain, because the shape of it is the whole point. He answered every technical question I threw at him without reaching for a single word. I asked him how he'd handle a supplier who was shorting us on tolerance on a batch of forged blanks, and he walked me through it step by step. First piece inspection, statistical process control, a conversation with the supplier's quality manager before it ever got to a phone call between principals, and I remember thinking, clean answer, good answer, better than the last 3 men I'd talked to. I asked him how he'd handle a line worker who kept missing safety protocol on a press break, and he told me about a man he'd had at Ohio Stamping who'd been skipping lockout to gout because it slowed him down, and how Marcus had pulled him off the floor for a full shift, sat with him, and walked him through exactly what his hand would look like if the die closed on it. Not to scare him, he said, but because respect means telling a man the truth instead of writing him up and calling it handled. That man, Marcus told me, became his best safety advocate on the floor inside of a year. I sat there and I nodded, and inside my own head, I was already writing him off, and here's the ugly specific truth of why. Ray had mentioned, in the pre-interview notes he'd sent me, that Marcus was active in a mentorship program pairing young black men coming out of the Youngstown school system with skilled trades apprenticeships. Something Marcus ran on his own weekends, unpaid, for going on 6 years. And instead of that registering to me as leadership, as exactly the kind of community standing that ought to matter to a company trying to build a workforce pipeline in a city running out of tradesmen, some small, ugly part of my mind filed it as a mark against him, like it told me something about where his priorities sat, like it made him a community guy instead of a company guy, and I want you to understand I'm not proud of writing that sentence. But I promised myself I'd say this plain, so there it is. I looked at a man mentoring at-risk teenagers on his own time for free, and I held it against him. Then I asked him the question I'd asked every candidate, the one I thought of as my real test. How would you handle it if you were standing on our floor next to a customer from Cummins, and that customer looked at you and asked why the plant manager didn't have an engineering degree? He didn't blink. He said, I'd tell them the same thing I'm telling you, that I've spent 14 years learning what a degree teaches you to guess at, and if that's not enough for them, that's a conversation for the plant manager to have honestly, not to dress around. It was a good answer. It was, if I'm being honest with you now, with 8 years of distance on it, the best answer anybody gave me in that whole search. And I sat across from him, and I decided it wasn't good enough, because somewhere in my gut, a place I'd trained for 30 years to trust over anything else, I had already decided that a customer from Cummins standing next to Marcus Webb was going to see exactly what I would have seen 2 years earlier, before I knew him. A black man off a factory floor with no engineering degree, and they were going to wonder if Kessler Machine was still a serious operation. I told myself I was protecting the company. That's the lie prejudice tells you every single time, that it's really just good business sense wearing a hard hat. At the end of the interview, I did something I want to tell you exactly. No softening. I looked at Marcus Webb across that table, at his resume between us, and I said, I appreciate you coming in, Marcus, I do. But I've got to be straight with you. This role sits in front of customers. It's not really about whether you can run a floor. I know you can run a floor. Anybody with eyes can see that in this resume. It's about whether you belong in that room when it's Cummins on the other side of the table, and I don't think you do. I don't think this is a place for a man like you. That last part hung there. I remember the sound the room made after I said it, which was no sound at all. Ray, sitting 2 chairs down, went very still, the way a man goes still when he's deciding how hard to fight something in front of his boss. He leaned forward and said, Dee, with respect, I don't think that's fair, and I don't think it's accurate, and I'd like it on record that I disagree with this. I looked at him, and I said, Noted, Ray, in a tone that closed the subject, and Ray sat back, jaw tight, and didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting, because he'd worked for me 11 years, and he knew when a door was shut. Marcus didn't argue with me. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ask me to explain myself, didn't do a single thing that would have let me feel righteous about my read on him. He looked at me for a second, steady, no heat in it that I could see, though I've thought since about what it must have cost him to keep it off his face. Then he reached forward, squared the corners of his folder against the table the exact same careful way he'd set it down, stood, buttoned his jacket, and said, Thank you for your time, Ms. Kessler. He shook Ray's hand on the way out. He didn't shake mine. I noticed that. I told myself at the time it didn't mean anything. He walked out of that conference room, and I watched him go. And for 1 second, 1 single second, I buried so fast I didn't look at it again for years. Something in me said, that man handled that better than you would have. I crushed that thought flat before it could finish forming. I picked up the next folder on my desk, a younger guy with a mechanical engineering degree from Case Western and 11 months of real floor experience, and I hired him inside the week. I was wrong the moment the words "a place for a man like you" left my mouth in that room, and I knew it. Somewhere under all the justification I'd built for myself. Even then, it would be 6 more years before I let myself know it out loud. The man I hired instead of Marcus was named Chris Voss. He lasted 14 months. I'll get to why, because it matters, but first I need to tell you about my son, because everything that broke open in my life after that interview ran straight through Danny. And if you don't understand Danny, you won't understand why the crack in my life opened where it did. Danny Kessler is my only child. He was 32 years old in 2018, working under Frank as head of sales, being groomed the way I'd been groomed, the way my father had been groomed before me, to take the company over one day. Danny had every advantage I never had. He went to Miami University, got a business degree, never spent a single summer sweeping metal shavings off a shop floor the way I had to. Because Frank and I had decided, somewhere along the way, that our son shouldn't have to earn it the hard way like I did. I want to flag that decision now, because I've turned it over 1,000 times since, and I think it was the first domino, though I didn't see it as one at the time. I built a company on the idea that you prove yourself with your hands, and then I spared my own son that exact proving, and I never once connected those two facts until they collided. Danny was a good kid. I want to say that plainly too, because nothing that happens later erases it. He was kind to the floor workers, remembered their kids' names, worked long hours, genuinely loved the business the way you love something you were handed early enough that it feels like it's always been yours. But he had, underneath the good kid, a soft spot I should have seen, and didn't, or saw and didn't want to name. He needed to be liked more than he needed to be right, and that is a dangerous thing in a man who's going to end up running 300 people someday. In the fall of 2020, in the middle of everything that was going wrong in the world that year, Danny made a decision that nearly took the company down with it. And it's the hinge this whole story turns on, so I'm going to tell it to you exactly as it happened. We had a supplier relationship with a forging outfit in Warren that had gone shaky. Late shipments, tolerance slippage, the kind of thing that should have triggered an immediate dual sourcing conversation. Danny, who by then had operational authority over supplier relationships that Frank and I probably handed him a couple years too early, kept extending them chance after chance because the owner of that forging outfit was a man Danny golfed with, a man Danny liked, a man who kept promising the next batch would be clean. It wasn't clean. 3 consecutive shipments came in out of spec, and Danny, instead of escalating it or dual sourcing the way any of us would have told him to, tried to quietly cover the gap by pulling material we'd earmarked for a different customer's order, a rush order for Meridian Axle, one of our biggest accounts, figuring he'd make it right before anyone noticed. Someone noticed. Meridian Axle received a batch of components that failed inspection on their end, on a run that went into agricultural equipment axles, safety-critical parts, and it triggered a full recall investigation on their side, and it very nearly triggered one on ours too, along with the possibility of losing a client that represented 11% of our annual revenue. I found out about it on a Tuesday morning in October, not from Danny, but from Meridian's VP of Quality calling Frank directly, furious. Using words like liability and breach of contract and we need to understand exactly what happened before we decide whether we can continue this relationship. Frank came and got me off the floor. I remember exactly where I was standing, next to the 4th CNC line, when he told me. I remember the particular kind of sick feeling that isn't just business trouble. It's a mother finding out her son did something and then tried to hide it, which is a different animal than finding out he made a mistake. We spent the next 6 weeks in something close to crisis mode. I won't drag you through every meeting, but here's what it came down to. We needed, immediately, a plant operations lead who could walk into Meridian's facility, sit across from their quality team, and rebuild a root cause corrective action plan credible enough that they wouldn't walk. Our current plant manager, Chris Voss, the man I'd hired over Marcus Webb 2 years before, folded under the pressure completely. He couldn't answer Meridian's questions with any precision, kept deferring to engineers who weren't in the room, and in the second meeting with Meridian's quality VP, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Adeyemi, Chris actually said the words, "I'll have to get back to you on that," 3 separate times in a 40-minute call, and I watched Patricia's face change in real time. Watched her decide we were not a serious operation, which was, I'll note, with a bitterness I still feel, precisely the fear I'd used to justify passing over Marcus in the first place. And here it was happening anyway, with the man I'd chosen instead of him. I fired Chris Voss the following Monday, which left me, 6 weeks before a Meridian deadline that could end the relationship for good, with no plant manager, a son whose judgment I no longer fully trusted, a husband who was exhausted and furious in a way I'd rarely seen him, and a company reputation on the line with one of our largest customers. Ray Petrosky came into my office that Monday afternoon, closed the door and said, "Dee, I'm only going to say this once, and then I'll drop it if you tell me to. You need someone who can walk into a room with an angry customer and make them believe the floor is under control. Because it isn't right now. Not really. And you know it isn't. I know exactly one man who could do that inside a week. You already met him. You turned him down. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I asked Ray if he happened to know whether Marcus Webb was still at Ohio Stamping. Ray told me Marcus wasn't at Ohio Stamping anymore. He'd left about a year after our interview and taken a job as an independent operations consultant, doing turnaround work for manufacturers in exactly the kind of crisis we were sitting in. Ray had run into him at a trade event that summer. Marcus was doing well. Better than well, Ray said, in a tone I understood was meant to needle me a little, and I let him, because I'd earned it. I sat with that for 2 days before I picked up the phone. Pride is a specific kind of stupid, and I want to be honest that pride, not principle, is what cost me those 2 days. I knew what I needed to do. I just didn't want to be the woman making that call. On a Wednesday morning, I called the number Ray gave me. Marcus answered on the third ring. In the middle, it sounded like, of walking somewhere, machinery noise faint behind him. I identified myself. There was a pause on the line, not long, maybe 2 seconds, but I felt every bit of it. Miss Kessler, he said. Flat, not unfriendly, not friendly either. A man giving nothing away. I told him, as plainly as I could manage, what had happened with Meridian, what we needed, and that I was calling to ask if he'd consider coming in as a consultant, short-term, to help us rebuild a corrective action plan and stand in front of the customer while we found a permanent plant manager. I did not, in that first call, apologize for the interview 2 years before. I want to be honest about that failure too, because it's part of the shape of this. I was so focused on the crisis in front of me that I let myself believe the professional ask could stand on its own, separate from what I'd said to him in that conference room, like 2 years hadn't happened, like he hadn't walked out of my building without shaking my hand. Marcus was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "What's the timeline?" Meridian wants a corrective action review in 5 weeks. We need someone in the building before then. Another pause. I've got 2 other engagements running right now. I'd need to look at what I can move. I'll pay whatever rate makes that possible, I said. Which was true, and which was also, I understood even as I said it, a way of trying to buy back with money something that had nothing to do with money. I'll call you back tomorrow, he said, and hung up before I could say anything else. He called back the next afternoon and said yes. He never told me, then, or for a long time after, exactly why. I used to assume it was the money, or the professional challenge, or Ray's relationship with him smoothing the way. I found out much later it was none of those things, or not mainly those things, and what it actually was is going to take the rest of this story to tell you properly. But he said yes, and 11 days after that call, Marcus Webb walked back through the front doors of Kessler Machine and Fastener Company, this time not as a man asking me for a job, but as a man I was paying by the week to save mine. The first morning Marcus came back, I made a point of being on the floor to meet him at 7, because I understood, even through all my other failures of understanding, that showing up mattered more than any sentence I could construct. He came in wearing work boots this time, not the gray suit, jeans and a company polo he must have grabbed from somewhere, because Ohio Stamping's old logo was still faint under a patch someone had ironed over it. He shook Ray's hand warmly, the 2 of them clearly glad to see each other, and then he turned to me and shook my hand too, brief, professional, a transaction completed, and nothing more. "Ms. Kessler," he said, "let's walk the floor. I want to see the line before I see the paperwork." For the next 5 weeks, I watched Marcus Webb work. And I want to tell you about that work in some detail. Because it matters that you understand exactly what I'd turned down 2 years before, not as some abstract idea of he was good, but in specifics. Because specifics are the only thing that ever got through to me about anything in my life. He spent the first 2 days doing nothing but walking the line and asking questions, not of me, not of Danny, but of the machine operators themselves, first shift and second shift both, staying past his contracted hours without being asked to. Because he said the third shift guys deserved the same respect of being asked directly instead of through a supervisor's summary. He found the root cause of the meridian tolerance failure inside 4 days, and it wasn't what any of our engineers had assumed. It wasn't a dieware issue. It was a fixture that had been modified 18 months earlier by a well-meaning maintenance tech to fix an unrelated alignment complaint, a modification nobody had ever logged in the change control system, which meant every piece coming off that station for 1.5 years had been running against a spec that existed nowhere on paper. Marcus found it by asking a second shift operator named Louis Guerrero a single question nobody had thought to ask. Had anything about that fixture ever felt different to run than it used to? Louis said yes immediately. Said he'd mentioned it to a supervisor once, years back, and been told it was fine. Marcus didn't make a show of finding it. He came to my office, laid out the documentation trail plainly, told me what needed to happen, corrected fixture, full reinspection of affected inventory, a documented change control failure acknowledged honestly to Meridian rather than buried, and a new verification protocol going forward so it couldn't happen silently again. I asked him how he wanted to handle telling Meridian, whether he wanted me and Danny in the room, or whether he thought it'd land better coming from him alone. I want everyone in the room who has authority to make commitments, he said. I'm not going to be the only black man in a room promising a fix and then watching a Kessler walk in behind me and get asked to confirm it before they believe it. If I'm presenting with full authority behind me, visibly, or I'm not doing it. I felt that sentence land somewhere specific, a place I didn't examine closely enough yet, and I said, understood. And I made sure it happened exactly that way. The Meridian review took place on a Thursday in late November. In our largest conference room, Patricia Adeyemi and 2 of her engineers on video, Frank and Danny and me in the room, Ray beside Marcus at the head of the table. Marcus walked Patricia through the entire failure, root cause, corrective action, verification protocol, in 18 minutes. No notes, no hedging, and when Patricia asked a hard question about how we'd guarantee this kind of undocumented change couldn't happen again anywhere else in the plant, Marcus didn't defer to an engineer sitting silent in the room the way Chris Voss had. He answered it himself, in specifics, citing a new fixture audit process he'd already implemented on his second day, 3 days before this meeting was even scheduled. Patricia Adeyemi said, "At the end of that call, this is the most direct root cause explanation I've gotten from a supplier in 15 years of doing this job. We're staying." Then she asked, "Who are you exactly? You weren't on my contact sheet before this." "Independent consultant," Marcus said. "Kessler brought me in to run this." "Well," Patricia said, "somebody there made a smart call." I sat in that room and I felt the particular shame of hearing a stranger praise a decision that had cost me 2 days of pride to make and should have cost me nothing at all. Should have been the obvious call from the start, 4 years earlier, before any of this crisis existed to force my hand. Meridian stayed. The crisis passed, and I want to be honest that even after all of that, even after watching him work at a level I hadn't seen from anyone in that plant manager role in a decade, I still hadn't reckoned with anything. I'd filed it, in the moment, as Marcus turned out to be very good, which is not the same thing as I was wrong to say what I said, though I didn't understand the difference yet, and I want you to hold on to that distinction, because the story isn't over, and neither is my failure to understand it. What actually cracked me open wasn't the Meridian save. It was something that happened 4 months later, in March of 2021, and it had nothing to do with the business at all. Frank had a heart attack. He was 61, seemingly healthy, played golf twice a week, and he went down on the second floor of our building on a Tuesday afternoon, in the hallway outside the accounting office, in full cardiac arrest. I wasn't in the building. I was at a supplier site 40 minutes away. Danny was in a meeting off-site with a client. The person who found Frank on the floor, who called 911 immediately, who started chest compressions on my husband without a second's hesitation because he happened to be walking that hallway on his way to review the fixture audit paperwork with our quality manager, was Marcus Webb. I got the call from Ray while I was still on the highway, and I don't remember much of that drive except the color of the sky, which is a strange thing to remember and the only thing I do remember. By the time I got to St. Elizabeth's, Frank was in surgery and Ray was in the waiting room, and he told me, in pieces, because he could see I couldn't take it all at once, that Marcus had done compressions for 6 full minutes before the paramedics arrived, that the paramedics had told Ray those 6 minutes were very likely the reason Frank still had a pulse when they got there, that Marcus had ridden in the ambulance because nobody else who knew Frank was in the building at that exact moment, and someone needed to give the hospital his information, his allergies, his blood thinner prescription, which Marcus somehow knew because he'd overheard Frank mention it once in passing weeks before and had simply remembered it, the way he seemed to remember every detail anyone ever told him. I found Marcus in that waiting room too, still in his work clothes, a smear of something on his sleeve I didn't ask about. He stood up when he saw me. I don't remember deciding to do it, but I put both my arms around a man I had told, 3 years before, that he didn't belong in my building, and I held on to him in a hospital waiting room like he was the only solid thing left standing. And he let me, stiff for a second and then not stiff, his hand coming up flat and steady against my back. "He's got a strong heart," Marcus said, when I finally let go, his voice quiet, no performance in it at all. "Fighting hard in there." "You should sit down before you fall down, Ms. Kessler." I sat down. I didn't say thank you yet, not properly, not in the way it needed saying, because I was too far inside my own fear that day to say anything with the weight it deserved. That would come later, and it would cost me more than a sentence to say it right. Frank survived. Triple bypass, 6 weeks of recovery, a changed diet he still complains about to this day. He is alive right now, this minute, as I'm telling you this story. Because Marcus Webb happened to be walking down a hallway he had no obligation to be walking down, doing a job I had told him 4 years earlier he wasn't fit to hold. I want to stop here and say something plainly, because it's the hinge of everything that comes after, and if I let it slide by without saying it directly, you might mistake the shape of what happened to me. It would be easy, and wrong, to tell you that this is the moment I understood I'd been unjust to Marcus Webb, that I looked at him saving my husband's life and thought, this remarkable man deserved better than what I gave him. That telling would be a kind of lie, a comfortable one, because it would let the lesson be about how exceptional he turned out to be, and that was never the actual lesson, even if it's the one my instincts reached for first in that waiting room. Marcus Webb did not owe my family 6 minutes of chest compressions to prove he belonged in my building. He would have belonged in that building, deserved the plant manager job, deserved my respect and my trust, even if he'd never once crossed paths with Frank in that hallway. even if he'd spent those years running someone else's floor and I'd never seen him again. The wrong I did him in that conference room in 2018 was wrong the moment I said it, full stop. Because I judged a man's fitness for a room by the color of his skin, dressed up as a judgment about polish, and no later act of heroism was required to make that judgment wrong, any more than an act of heroism would have been required to make it right. I sat in that hospital waiting room for a long time turning that distinction over, and it would take me years more to fully separate the gratitude I felt from the reckoning I still owed him. Because gratitude is easy, and reckoning is not, and I want to be honest that for a while I let the easy feeling stand in for the hard one, and that was its own kind of failure. A quieter one, but a failure all the same. Frank's recovery took the better part of that spring, and during those weeks Marcus stayed on past his original contract, because by then, Ray and I both knew we needed him permanently, not as a consultant, but as the plant manager the position had needed all along. I made him the offer myself, in my office, no crisis forcing my hand this time, just the plain truth that he was the best operations mind I'd ever had in that building and I wanted him running it. He took 2 weeks to answer. I understood why, though he didn't say it outright yet, and I didn't push. It was during those weeks, while Frank was still in cardiac rehab and I was running ragged between the hospital and the plant, that the rest of who Marcus Webb was started coming to me, piece by piece, almost never from him directly. That's a thing I noticed about him early, and understood better as time went on. He did not narrate his own life to people. Everything I learned from other people telling me, usually without meaning to teach me anything, just mentioning facts in passing the way you'd mention weather. Louis Guerrero, the second shift operator, told me one afternoon, unprompted, while I was walking the floor trying to look useful and mostly failing, that Marcus had personally driven him to a court date 8 years back, when Louis was fighting to keep custody of his younger brother after their mother went into treatment, because Louis didn't have a car that ran that week and the buses didn't go out to the county courthouse. Louis said Marcus didn't know him well at the time. They'd worked together maybe 4 months at Ohio Stamping. Marcus just heard about it in the break room and offered. Patricia Adeyemi called me directly, about a month after the Meridian review, just to check in on the account, and mentioned in passing that she'd looked Marcus up after that call because she'd been impressed and found out he sat on the board of a Youngstown nonprofit that placed formerly incarcerated men into skilled trades apprenticeships, had sat on it for 9 years, had personally vouched for and trained over 30 men through that program, most of whom were still working trades jobs in the valley today. I don't usually go digging on a supplier's staff, Patricia said, but I wanted to know who'd just saved my company a recall. Man's got a hell of a reason outside of yours, too. Ray told me one evening over a beer we hadn't planned on having about the mentorship program Marcus ran on weekends, the one I'd once held against him in an interview without ever saying so out loud. And Ray told me Marcus had been doing it since his own daughter Simone was in middle school. Because Marcus had grown up without a father in the house, and without a single man in his life who'd shown him a trade could be a whole life and not just a fallback. And he'd decided a long time ago he wasn't going to let any boy in his old neighborhood grow up not knowing that if he could help it. Ray told me one of the young men Marcus had mentored, a kid who'd been heading toward real trouble at 16, was now a certified welder with his own small fabrication business 2 towns over, and still called Marcus every Father's Day. And then, near the end of April, Marcus's wife Renata mentioned something to me at a small dinner Frank insisted on hosting once he was cleared to have people over, a dinner meant as a thank you, though Marcus had tried twice to talk Frank out of making a fuss. Renata mentioned, in the kind of easy, unguarded way you tell a stranger something true about your marriage, that Marcus had turned down that Cleveland job offer years back. The bigger one, not just because of Simone's school year, the way Ray had told me, but because his grandmother, the woman who'd raised him after his mother died, was in her final years by then, in a care facility in Youngstown, and Marcus visited her every single Sunday without fail, had for 6 years straight, and he wasn't going to be 2 hours away for whatever time she had left. She'd passed the year before I met him. He still visited her grave every Sunday instead, Renata said. He didn't tell people that. He just did it. I sat at that dinner table and I listened to Renata say all of this so plainly, so without any sense that she was handing me something enormous, and I understood I'd been given, across 8 months in fragments, the full outline of a man I had once looked at for 35 minutes and decided I already knew everything necessary to know. I want to describe to you what it felt like sitting there, because I promised you I'd tell this honest. Hands, not chest. And the honest truth is, I sat very still, and I picked at the edge of the tablecloth with my thumbnail, folding a little pleat into it over and over. Because if I let my hand stop moving, I was going to have to feel the whole size of what I'd done. And I wasn't ready yet, not even then, to feel it in front of people. I said almost nothing for the rest of that dinner. Frank noticed. He didn't ask me about it until we were home, and when he did, I told him the truth, which was that I didn't trust myself to speak yet, because everything I might say was going to come out either too small or too self-pitying, and I didn't want to make my own reckoning into something Marcus had to manage the size of, on top of everything else. I understood, sitting at that table, that a nonprofit board, a mentorship program, a grandmother visited every Sunday for 6 years, and then every Sunday after that at her grave, 6 minutes of chest compressions on a man he had every reason in the world to feel nothing for. None of that was what made my original judgment wrong. He would have been exactly as deserving of respect and a fair hearing if none of that were true. If he'd simply gone home every night after his shift and watched television and loved his family quietly and never mentored a single soul. The facts I was learning weren't evidence assembled to overturn a verdict. There had never been a legitimate verdict to overturn. What those facts did, the only thing they honestly did, was strip away every excuse I might have still been keeping in reserve. Every but I might have still been holding on to without admitting it. The idea that maybe my read on him hadn't been entirely fair, but there'd been something reasonable underneath it. There was nothing reasonable underneath it. There never had been. I had looked at a man's skin and his zip code and his lack of a 4-year degree and decided, on sight, what he was capable of, and I had dressed that decision up in language about polish and customer perception. Because that language let me feel like a businesswoman making a hard call instead of what I actually was in that room, which was a woman repeating, in a nicer suit, the exact same insult a stranger had once aimed at my own father in Detroit in 1983. Except I was aiming it at a man who had never done a single thing to me except sit across a table and answer my questions with more honesty than I'd given him back. I drove out to see Marcus at his home on a Sunday afternoon in early May, 3 weeks after that dinner, because I understood by then that whatever I owed him, I owed it to him directly, in a room, not folded into a work conversation where I could hide behind operational language if it got hard. Renata answered the door and looked a little surprised to see me standing there without Frank, but she let me in, and Marcus came out from the backyard, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands from something in the garden, and he looked at my face for a second before I'd said a word, and I think he understood exactly why I'd come. Because he told Renata he'd be a minute. And he walked me out onto the front porch instead of into the house, which I understood, later, thinking about it, was its own kind of boundary. He was willing to hear me out, but not willing to let whatever I was about to say into the rooms where his family lived. We stood there a moment, neither of us saying anything. And then I said it, plain, the way I'd promised myself I would, no dressing it up. I told you 4 years ago you didn't belong in that building. I said it because you're a black man who came up off a factory floor instead of an engineering program, and I decided, before you ever opened your mouth in that interview, that you couldn't sit across from a customer and be taken seriously. And I dressed that up as a judgment about polish, because that was easier for me to live with than telling myself the truth about what it actually was. I was wrong. I was wrong that day, sitting across from you, before Frank ever had a heart attack. Before Meridian, before any of it. None of what you've done since is why I was wrong. I want to be clear, I know that. You didn't have to save my husband's life, or run a mentorship program, or do one single extraordinary thing to have deserved better than what I gave you in that room. You deserved better than that, because you're a person who came in honest and answered honest, and I looked at you and decided your honesty didn't matter next to what you looked like walking in. I'm not asking you to tell me it's fine. I know it isn't fine. I just needed you to hear me say the actual thing, not some softer version of it. Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked out at the street, not at me, hands loose at his sides, and when he finally spoke his voice was even, careful, no performance of forgiveness in it, and no performance of anger either. I appreciate you saying it straight, he said. Most people don't. Most people give you the version where it comes out sounding like an accident, like a misunderstanding, like they were just being cautious. You didn't do that, and I'll give you credit for it. He paused. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, because it isn't, and I'm not going to tell you I've spent the last 4 years thinking about you, Miss Kessler, because I haven't. I've had my own life to run, my own family, my own work, and you were one bad afternoon in the middle of it, not the center of it. That interview cost me 18 months of income I could have had if I'd taken a different offer instead of holding out hope somebody in this town would look past what you looked past. It cost my kids some things too. Some years where money was tighter than it needed to be. You didn't take my life from me. I built a good one anyway. But you took something from those 18 months that I don't get back, and I'm not going to pretend that's nothing just because you're standing on my porch saying the right words now. I understand, I said. And I did, and I made myself hold still and not fill the silence with anything that would let me off easier than I deserved. I took the plant manager job because you're running the best operation in the valley to actually do this kind of work in. And because Ray's a good man and vouched hard for you changing. And because I watched you these past months and you didn't flinch once from hard truths on the floor, Marcus said. That's not nothing. That tells me something real about who you are now. But I didn't take it because I forgive you, and I'm not going to sit here and hand you that today just because it'd make this conversation easier for both of us. If that's going to happen at all, it's going to happen slow, and it's going to happen because of what you do next, not because of what you just said, even though what you just said was the right thing to say. I told him that was fair. I told him I wasn't there looking for absolution, that I understood I didn't get to set the timeline on whether he ever trusted me the way he trusted Ray, and that I intended to earn whatever ground I earned the same way he'd have to earn anything from anyone, one honest action at a time. He nodded, once, and said he needed to get back to the garden before Renata came looking for him, and that was the end of the conversation. He didn't shake my hand that day either. I noticed that too. The same as the first time, and this time I understood exactly what it meant, and I didn't reach for his hand. Because it wasn't mine to ask for. I want to tell you what earning it slow actually looked like in practice, because it wasn't one grand gesture. It was a list of specific things, done over specific stretches of time, And I think the specificity is the only part of it that means anything, so I'll give it to you that way. The first thing I did, inside a month of that conversation on his porch, was go to Marcus with the actual employment file from 2018, the internal notes I'd written after that interview. And I told him I wanted to correct the record formally, not quietly bury it. Our HR director at the time, a woman named Sandra Filipiak, kept permanent hiring files. And mine had a line in it, in my own handwriting, that I'd written the afternoon of that interview: strong technical skills, not a fit for customer-facing role at this time. I asked Sandra to pull that file, and in front of both Marcus and Sandra, I wrote a formal addendum to it, dated, signed, stating plainly that the 2018 decision had been made based on my own prejudice and not on any deficiency in the candidate, and that the language used at the time did not reflect the company's standards, nor should it have reflected mine. I did that because Marcus had once told me, standing on his porch, that most people give you the version that sounds like an accident. I wanted there to be a piece of paper somewhere in my own company's records that didn't let me do that to myself later. That would still say the true thing even after I was gone and couldn't explain it to anyone. The second thing cost more, and I want to tell you honestly that I hesitated before doing it, which tells you something about how far I still had to go even after that porch conversation. Our board met quarterly. 9 members, half of them men who'd sat on that board since my father's time, and who talked, sometimes, in the particular loose way older men in that valley still talked when they thought nobody was going to push back. At the June board meeting, when Marcus's name came up in the context of the operations report he'd prepared, one of the older members, a man named Gerald Whitfield who'd known my father 40 years, made a comment, not vicious, just careless, about how surprising it was that someone with Marcus's background had turned the plant around so fast, the kind of comment dressed up as a compliment that actually reveals exactly what somebody expected going in. 4 years earlier I would have let that comment pass, maybe even nodded along to keep the peace in the room, because Gerald was 78 years old and set in his ways, and I didn't like conflict with men who'd known my father. Instead, I stopped the meeting, and I told the room, plainly, that Marcus Webb's turnaround wasn't surprising to anyone who'd actually looked at his record. That the only reason it might seem surprising to anyone in that room was the same reason I'd once turned him down for the job outright, and that I wasn't going to let that kind of assumption sit unchallenged in a meeting I was chairing, not after what it had already cost this company once. Gerald didn't say much after that. I don't know if I changed his mind. But I said it in front of 8 people, at real risk to a relationship I'd maintained my whole career, instead of saying it quietly to Marcus later, where it would have cost me nothing. The third thing was about money and title both. When Marcus formally accepted the plant manager role that May, I didn't just match what Chris Voss had been paid. I went back through what the role should have paid in 2018 had he been hired then, ran the math on 4 years of wage growth in that position, and structured his starting compensation not as a generous new offer, but as a correction, explicitly labeled that way in the offer letter, with a signing structure that accounted for the gap. I also gave him a title Chris Voss had never held: Director of Operations, not just plant manager, with real authority over supplier decisions company-wide, the exact authority that, had it existed and sat with someone like Marcus back in 2020, might have caught Danny's supplier problem with Meridian before it ever became a crisis at all. I told Marcus, when I offered it, that I wasn't creating the title to make a point. I was creating it because the company needed exactly that function, and he was plainly the person suited to run it, and if the timing looked like it was about the past, that was fine. Because the past was in fact part of why I finally understood the role needed to exist. The fourth thing took the longest, and it's the one I'm proudest of having done right, slow and without rushing him. Over the 2 years that followed, I watched Marcus continue his mentorship work on his own time, the way he always had. And I never once tried to fold it into the company, or claim credit for it, or make it part of some tidy redemption story about Kessler Machine. What I did instead, when he mentioned once, almost in passing, that funding for tool purchases for his mentees had always come out of his own pocket, was set up a company scholarship fund, administered independently, not run through Marcus at all, so it would never look like I was buying his good opinion through his own program. That covered tool costs and testing fees for any young person coming up through certified trade programs in the Valley. I put Ray in charge of it, not myself, and I made sure Marcus knew, clearly, that he was under no obligation to ever be publicly associated with it if he didn't want his personal work tangled up with anything bearing the Kessler name. He didn't take me up on connecting it to his program for the better part of a year. When he finally did, quietly, sending 2 of his mentees through it without ceremony, he told me only afterward, and only in passing, the same understated way he told me everything. None of this happened in a straight line, and none of it happened fast. There were long stretches where Marcus and I worked together with a kind of clean, professional distance, respectful, effective, and nothing more, and I made myself be satisfied with that, because pushing for more would have been its own kind of taking. It was probably 3 years after that porch conversation, sometime in 2024, before I noticed something had shifted without either of us marking the moment. We were walking the floor together, reviewing a new fixture audit process he wanted to roll out company-wide, and he made a dry joke about Gerald Whitfield's retirement party the month before. Something small and sharp and funny. The kind of joke you only make in front of someone you've decided isn't going to make you regret it. I laughed, and he looked a little surprised at himself for having made it, and neither of us said anything about what that meant, but I understood, walking back to my office that afternoon, that something had settled between us that hadn't been there the year before, and that I hadn't earned it by asking for it. I'd earned it, if I'd earned it at all, by simply doing the work in front of me, year over year, and staying out of his way about the rest. Marcus Webb is 50 years old now, still director of operations at Kessler Machine and Fastener, still married to Renata, who's a vice principal these days at the same school district she used to teach in. Simone finished nursing school and works in the cardiac unit at St. Elizabeth's, the very hospital that treated Frank, which Marcus has never once mentioned to me as poetic or meaningful. Because I don't think he sees his daughter's career as a symbol of anything, and neither should I. Elijah just started at Youngstown State this past fall, industrial engineering, the degree his father never had time to chase the traditional way. Marcus still visits his grandmother's grave every Sunday. He still runs his mentorship program, still unpaid, still on his own weekends, and he still, as far as I know, has never once told anyone at Kessler Machine the full story of everything he built in those 18 months I cost him. Because it was never a story that needed my company's name in it to matter. I don't get to call us close friends. I want to be honest about that, since I promised you honesty and not the version that ties off neat. We work well together. He trusts my word on operational matters more than he did 5 years ago, and I've earned enough of his patience that he'll tell me plainly when he thinks I'm wrong about something, which is its own kind of gift. Because a man doesn't correct you plainly unless he's decided it's worth the effort. But there's a wall that stayed up, a small one, and I think it's going to stay up for good, and I've made my peace with that, because it was never his job to hand me back what I threw away in that conference room. It was only ever mine to keep doing the next honest thing, whether or not it ever bought me anything back. So here's what I know now, plain, the way I promised I'd tell it to you. I said a man didn't belong in my building because of what he looked like and where he came from. And I dressed that judgment up in language about polish so I wouldn't have to look at what it actually was. I was wrong the second I said it. Not wrong because he later saved my husband's life on a hallway floor. Not wrong because he turned a failing operation around in 5 weeks. Not wrong because a customer, with 15 years in the business, called him the most credible supplier voice she'd ever heard. Wrong before any of that. Wrong the moment the words left my mouth, because a man's dignity was never mine to weigh against a customer's comfort in the first place. If Marcus Webb had never crossed my path again after that interview, if he'd simply gone on to build his good life somewhere else, and I'd never had the chance to learn one single fact about who he was, I'd still have been just as wrong sitting across that table from him as I turned out to be. I want that understood clearly, because it's the only part of this whole story I need you to carry with you when it's done. What he built afterward is his. It belongs to him, and to Renata, and to Simone and Elijah, and to the boys in his mentorship program, and to a grandmother he still visits on Sundays. None of it was owed to me as proof. I was never entitled to the evidence. I was only ever required to have been fair in the first place. And I wasn't, and 8 years later that's still the plain fact, sitting at the bottom of everything I've told you. I don't say this out loud often. I don't intend to say it again after tonight. But it needed saying once, all the way through, without the parts I usually leave out. If this one hit you the way it hit me telling it, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, hard-earned stories.